Welcome, everyone. My name is Stephanie Yeager. I am currently the president of Les Dames d'Escoffier, and I am so thrilled to have you here today for our first LDEI live online program. Whether you're a member of LDEI or just hearing about us for the first time, it's my privilege to introduce you to our remarkable organization. LDEI is a global community of women leaders in food, beverage, and hospitality who are committed to excellence and philanthropy. Our mission is to inspire, advance, and support women in our industries, helping them achieve their greatest potential in leadership and beyond. We do this through education, mentorship, networking, and meaningful initiatives that elevate the voices and talents of women around the world. For our members, LDEI is a place to connect with like-minded peers, share ideas, and make an impact in our industries and our communities. For those of you who may be new to LDEI, we hope this program offers a glimpse into the incredible opportunities, relationships, and inspiration that make our organization so special. No matter where you are in your journey, we invite you to join us in creating a future where women thrive as leaders, innovators, and change makers. Now it is my pleasure to introduce today's moderator, Dame Sheila Cry.
Hello, welcome. I'm Sheila Cry, chair of the LDEI Live Online Committee, and I'm a LDEI board member. We are talking today about planning for retirement because it is a topic requested by members of Les Dames d'Escoffier International. There are few people more qualified to write about retirement planning than Christine Benz. She's the Director of Personal Finance and Retirement Planning for Morningstar, host of the Longview podcast, and author of the best-selling book, How to Retire, 20 Lessons for a Happy, Successful, and Wealthy Retirement. And she's a senior columnist for Morningstar.com. Christine took a unique approach with this book, choosing to interview 20 retirement thought leaders and diving deep with each about a single lesson that they believe contributes to retirement success. I have read the book, How to Retire, and I like how Christine translates some of the financial terms of art used by her interviewees into everyday English. At the end of each chapter, I like her takeaway summaries of important points, as well as the 2 to 4 related resources she suggests for further reading. Best of all, Christine integrates financial considerations with the emotional and developmental tasks of retirement, drawing a nuanced picture of what we can expect. Aided with that knowledge, we as individuals can adapt to our circumstances to attain the safety and security we all need. And now, here's Christine Benz.
Sheila, thank you so much for the kind introduction. Thanks to all of you for taking part out of your day to be with us. I'm really excited to talk to this group. I am part of a family of 6 girls, 6 women now, and so was happily raised in a family where we really had the sense that we could do anything the guys could do because there weren't any guys around to compete with except for my dad, and my dad really threw himself into helping to raise his daughters. So I am a big believer in women empowerment, and I love to discuss the intersection with retirement planning because, frankly, when we look at the data on women in retirement, it's a pretty sobering picture that in aggregate, we are behind our male counterparts with respect to retirement readiness. We tend to be more likely to be poor in retirement. We tend to be more likely to be exclusively reliant on Social Security. We don't have that balanced sort of investment mix to augment Social Security. So that's what I'm going to be talking about today. I know that many of you have had kind of non-traditional career paths. You haven't necessarily had the opportunity to save within the context of an employer provided retirement plan. So I'll kind of gloss over those aspects of my book that do focus on traditional retirement and try to shade things a little bit more in the direction of non-traditional retirement. And then I also love to hear questions because it gives me a sense of what I should be working on in the future. So we will have time for your questions after I run through the presentation. I'm just going to share my screen because I have provided a little bit of a PowerPoint presentation. So let me just share my screen here. And you should be able to see this. Just backing up.
We can see it, Christine.
Okay, great. So this is a Cliff's Notes edition of my book. And for those of you who are old enough to remember Cliff's Notes, and I think they're still out there, but this was like something you would look to if you found yourself on a Sunday night and you hadn't read Moby Dick yet or something like that, or A Tale of Two Cities. You would need to quickly get up to speed on what was in the book. And so that's the focus of the presentation. It's a distilled version of some of the lessons in my book. As Sheila mentioned, my book has 20 lessons. I'll just cover 10 in the course of this presentation, and we will have some time for questions at the end. So one of the key lessons that I take away when I think about retirement planning is the importance of being holistic about it. I think, unfortunately, for the years that I worked on retirement planning, I was so focused on the financial piece that I didn't think a lot about the non-financial piece. And then I think there are people at sort of the opposite side of the spectrum where they have been focused exclusively on, okay, what am I going to do when I have more time to pursue my passions? And they've thought less about the financial aspect of retirement. So it's really helpful to approach this in totality, to think about, in addition to your financial wherewithal, thinking about what you will do for purpose and identity when you separate from work, what you will do for structure, because it turns out structure is really important for us throughout our lives, not just during our traditional working lives. You want to be thinking about relationships and family. And this is especially important for men, actually, when we look at the data on men later in life, when they step away from work, oftentimes they're losing some important relationships. For women, we tend to be a little better balanced throughout our lives, that we have relationships in our communities, with children and parents of children, that we tend to have more diverse social networks than men. But nonetheless, it's worth thinking about your relationships as you move into later in life. And then also related to financial considerations, but not exclusively financial, would be housing related decisions, healthcare related decisions, and finally goals for your last chapter of your life, whether that's 20 or 30 years or more, really being thoughtful about what you want to accomplish during those last years. I won't spend a lot of time on these topics during the course of this presentation, but they're very much a part of my book, the non-financial and the financial aspects of retirement planning. Another key lesson as I think about successful retirements is the virtue of phasing into retirement if you possibly can. And of course, this might not be exactly within your control. In fact, we tend to see a little bit of a disconnect when we look at the data, that people think that they will be able to work longer than they actually are able to. That we often see that people think that they'll be able to work uh, until 70 or even past 70, whereas many people do retire earlier than they expected. This is a quote from my book from Laura Karstensen, who heads up the Stanford Center on Longevity. She talks about the virtue of work, how work, whether paid or unpaid work, is really valuable for us in a lot of ways. But the way that we work in this country, where a lot of people show up in retirement just completely burned out is not a good model. That ideally we would, once we hit our 50s, for example, we'd start thinking about phasing into retirement, maybe sort of a gradual segue into being fully retired. It turns out that's a really good model for a couple of reasons. One is that obviously, from a financial standpoint, if you can continue earning an income, that's good for your finances. The key reason is that it lessens the impact on your portfolio. So if you are going to be drawing on your retirement assets, if you can shrink that time horizon that you'll be drawing upon that portfolio, it just makes everything easier. Working longer in some fashion may also allow you to delay Social Security filing, which can have important benefits, especially if you think you have average or longer than average life expectancy. You may have the opportunity to continue to contribute to your savings if you're able to continue working longer. And those are often kind of catch up years for many people where if they've had children, college funding for those children is in the rear view mirror. It might be the empty nest phase. And those are peak earnings years that enable some people, not all, but some people to continue to make retirement contributions. There may also be additional opportunities for tax sheltered compounding. If you're contributing here in the US in the context of an IRA, for example, you are able to shelter those funds from taxes as long as they remain inside the account. Also, speaking of required minimum distributions, if you are contributing to some sort of an employer provided plan, and even if you are subject to those required minimum distributions, which kick in once you hit age 73, if you're continuing to contribute to that company retirement plan, you can delay those required minimum distributions from that account. And finally, an important component of working longer from a financial standpoint is that if the market environment is bad, if stocks are down or bonds are down, and you don't want to have to withdraw from that portfolio, you can sidestep what retirement researchers call sequence risk, which basically means you're having to draw upon your portfolio at a bad time. If you can delay that retirement, you can sidestep or at least delay that sequence risk. And then there are certainly plenty of non-financial benefits that come along with working longer for people who can afford to do so. And there are a lot of the things that I talked about previously. So relationships, the opportunity for social interaction, purpose and identity, which many of us get from our jobs, the ability to have some structure in our days, some intellectual stimulation, and maybe a little bit of physical activity. I won't spend too much time on this because I know many of you don't work in a traditional employer context, but taking a phased approach is really valuable. And by the way, I'll just say that I'm happy to share these slides with anyone who would like them. So if the group has a mechanism for doing that, fine. If not, I can supply my email address and you can email me and I'll send ahead a PDF of the slides. Another key lesson when I think about retirement planning is to try to maximize any non-portfolio income sources that you have coming to you. So for many of us here in the US, that's Social Security. For a smaller share of us, that's a traditional pension. You might have income from working longer. You might have rental income if you own some property and you have tenants. And then there are other kind of idiosyncratic forms of cash flow that people may look to. So farmland, for example, that delivers regular income distributions. All of these are really valuable from the standpoint of retirement planning. So it really pays to make smart decisions about enlarging those sources of cash flows if we possibly can, because that really does alleviate pressures on the portfolio. So the benefits of maximizing those non-portfolio income sources is that it enables a lower portfolio withdrawal rate. So you're putting fewer demands on any investments that you've managed to accumulate. It makes it easier to be flexible with your portfolio withdrawals. So, for example, if you have a good share of your cash flow needs coming from Social Security, or at least your basic living expenses, then you can be flexible when it comes to drawing down from your portfolio. If the market isn't great and you'd rather leave more of your portfolio in place to recover when the market eventually does, if you've aligned your cash flow sources, your Social Security in particular, with your basic living expenses, that allows you to be somewhat flexible. Another key benefit of enlarging lifetime income sources is that they may be lifetime, so they may be promised to you throughout the whole of your life. And that's particularly true in the case of Social Security. Some annuities are also set up that way, and I'll just pause and explain what an annuity is. I'm by no means a huge believer in annuities, but it's a product that is similar to Social Security in that you have this contract with an insurance company where, in exchange for you giving them a chunk of money, and the annuity purchase amounts can vary significantly, but in exchange for making that lump sum payment, the insurance company agrees to send you a stream of income for as long as you live. And so the benefit of an annuity is that it can be used to augment Social Security. So Social Security is the best annuity that you cannot buy. It's only available through the government, but an annuity would be an additional source of lifetime income. So it's something to investigate, by no means the right answer for all people. And then another key benefit of non-portfolio income sources is that they might have some level of inflation protection embedded in them. So think about Social Security, for example. If inflation is high and you're receiving Social Security, your benefit adjusts to help address inflation. So in 2022, for example, that was the big inflationary shock that consumers had. Well, Social Security worked exactly as one would have hoped during that period, where not only did people get their payments, but they also got that inflation adjustment. And that's one other key reason to make sure that you are taking steps to maximize Social Security. So the best way to maximize Social Security is to delay if you possibly can. Delaying isn't always the right answer. So, for example, if for whatever reason you think you have shortened life expectancy and say you're a single person, you'd probably want to take it sooner, right? You'd want to get the benefits flowing to you because you're not sure how long you'll live. But if you think you will have average or above average life expectancy, and or you've been the main earner in your household and you have a spouse who will be reliant on your Social Security for his or her own benefit, in that case, it also might make sense to delay in order to enlarge the benefit for that spouse, especially if you think it's likely that spouse will outlive you. So it's a huge topic, but a key takeaway is to take steps to enlarge your non-portfolio income sources. Um, let's see. I'm going to gloss over this. People seem to be getting the message about delaying Social Security. So you can see on this slide that you can pick up a nice benefit for every year that you're able to delay past your full retirement age. So full retirement age today in the US is 67 with respect to Social Security. So if you take benefits at 67, you'll get what's considered your full benefit. But if you are able to delay a year or two or all the way up until age 70, you can see that you can pick up an 8% increase for every year that you delay past that full retirement age. So that's the reason that you want to consider delaying, because even though we've seen interest rates jump up on savings products recently, you can't beat an 8% guaranteed return that comes along with delaying Social Security. So this is something that I wanted to show you, which is that in the past, we had a lot of people claiming as soon as they were first eligible at age 62. And in some cases, you know, people do not have a choice. They need the money and they can't work for whatever reason. But we're seeing that the word is starting to get out about the benefits of delaying. So more and more people are delaying. And I would expect that over the past, say, 5 years since this slide came out, that we've seen additional people delaying Social Security, that we've seen these numbers go up a little bit. Another key thing to keep in mind with respect to retirement planning is to kind of know what your retirement income style is. We're all geared a little bit differently with respect to what we're looking for from retirement income. That some people might say, I just want a lot of certainty in my retirement income. I want it to be similar to the paycheck I might have had while I was working. In which case, certainly enlarging Social Security or perhaps considering something like an annuity would be appropriate. Other people might say, well, I'm comfortable with more variability, that if I have a portfolio that consists of stocks and bonds, there aren't any guarantees there, but I know that I have the opportunity for my assets to grow. And we're all geared a little bit differently in terms of what we're looking for. The other uh, s- uh, axis on this grid is how much you're looking for a specific solution, sort of a one and done type solution, versus how much you're comfortable with some variability. And you want access to your money on an ongoing basis. So there's a link in my book to take a little bit of a questionnaire to figure out where you are on this grid, whether you are someone who wants a very safe, permanent solution, even if it means that your investments won't grow as much, or if you're someone who wants the ability to access your funds, wants the ability to experience some investment growth. So I won't spend too much time on this. Another key thing to think about with respect to retirement planning is safe withdrawal rates. And some of you may have heard about what's called the 4% guideline for a safe withdrawal rate. But the key issue is when we embark on retirement and say we've accumulated some investment assets, we don't know how much we can safely draw upon that portfolio because we don't know how long we'll live. And we don't know how the stocks and bonds in that portfolio will behave over our time horizon. So this slide looks at just how much this has varied over time. So each point on this graph depicts what would have been a safe starting withdrawal percentage at any of these various points in market history with various configurations of investment portfolios. So you can see that that blue line, which is the all stock portfolio, over a lot of market environments, it did support the highest starting safe withdrawal percentage. So if you got really lucky, for example, and you retired in the late 1920s, for example, or right after World War II, you could take a really large portfolio withdrawal and inflation adjust that dollar amount thereafter and not have run out of money over a 30-year horizon. And then you have other market environments that are much less forgiving. So the 4% guideline that we've often heard about, or you may have heard about, is it comes from that period of kind of the late 1960s, early 1970s, where it didn't matter what was in your portfolio. The most you could have taken as a starting withdrawal percentage would have been 4%. So the 4% guideline, as we know it, is kind of built around that worst case scenario. If everything went wrong for the stock and bond markets during your particular retirement period, well, that's the highest starting percentage that you could have taken. And I'll just explain what we're talking about when we talk about the 4% guideline. It means that you are going to take 4% initially in the first year of retirement and then inflation adjust that dollar amount thereafter. So say I have $100,000 set aside for retirement. That means I get to take 4 $4,000, not a lot, but $4,000 initially, with that dollar amount inflation adjusted thereafter. So that's the basic thought process around the 4% guideline. But it's an important takeaway that it's built around a worst case scenario. There are a lot of market environments that aren't a worst case scenario. So it's wise to stay flexible. So as you sort of start your retirement and move through, to pick your head up and say, well, how are things going? Are stocks and bonds way down? Is my portfolio way down? In which case you're better off taking less from that portfolio if you can possibly afford to do so. And then in better market environments like the one we've had for the past couple of years, you should be able to take relatively more. So that's kind of a best practice when it comes to retirement spending, that if you can possibly be flexible with your expenditures, you should do so. Um, so let's see. This is a slide that depicts how our spending tends to change throughout retirement. And this is important to mention in this. So we're not just spending the same amount on adjusted for inflation throughout retirement, that we actually see that people's spending tends to dip throughout their retirement time horizon. So the beginning of the left-hand side of this left-hand side of the slide is the very starting point of retirement at 65. You can see it heads down, down, down through like age 85 and then flares up later in life. And the reason you see that flare up is quite understandably because of long-term care costs. The thing to know about long-term care is that it's actually a fairly small segment of our population that has catastrophic long-term care costs. And that elevates that right-hand side of the curve for everyone. But in reality, it's not the majority of people. Roughly half of us have some out-of-pocket long-term care costs, half of us don't. The problem is that you don't know in advance, obviously, which half you'll fall into. So we'll talk a little bit about long-term care planning in a second. I mentioned the value of being flexible with your retirement withdrawals if you can possibly afford to do so. There are lots of different variations on this. One of them is simply using required minimum distributions, or kind of the thought process behind required minimum distributions to help guide your spending. So that's simply portfolio value divided by life expectancy. So our life expectancy shrinks as we age. And so we're adjusting based on those two things, how our portfolios have performed, as well as our life expectancy. Let's see. Another lesson, and this is something I talk a lot about in my work on Morningstar, is structuring your portfolio to support your cash flows. So if you have an investment portfolio set aside, you probably don't want the whole thing to be in stocks. So even though stocks have performed really well in the recent past, they have periods where they don't perform well at all. So you want stocks to be a component of your investment portfolio, but you don't want them to be the whole shebang as you move into retirement. You need safer assets that you could reasonably draw upon if your stock portfolio were down. So that's the basic thought process with this bucket approach that I often talk about, where you're building roughly, say, 7 to 10 years worth of cash flows in safer investments. And then the rest of the portfolio can go into more aggressively positioned investments, mainly stocks. But the idea is that, stocks have had periods like the 2000s were a not too distant example, where stocks have gone down and basically flatlined for a whole decade. Well, you wouldn't want your portfolio to be entirely stocks during a period like that, right? You wouldn't want to have to withdraw from a dwindling portfolio. So that's the basic structure in this bucket approach. I have a lot of model portfolios on Morningstar.com. And by the way, Morningstar is an investment research firm. My work is all part of our free website. It's there for educational purposes. Some of you may know Morningstar, the veggie burger people. We're not the veggie burger people, we're investment research, but there's a ton of free information there if you're looking to check up on various investments or you're looking to get some advice on how to structure a portfolio. We've got lots of articles and videos to help you. So this is just a sample portfolio for someone who is about to embark on retirement that uses the bucket strategy. Again, you're welcome to these slides if it would be helpful, but the basic idea is if someone has a nice portfolio of $1.5 million, they're setting aside roughly 2 years worth of their expected cash flows in cash investments, and then they're stepping out on the risk spectrum a little bit. So they have another component of the portfolio that's going into a high quality bond portfolio, and then the remainder of that portfolio could be in stocks. So in this case, the majority of the portfolio is in stocks, but it really does depend on how much you're taking out of the portfolio. That's how you determine how much to drop into each of these buckets. So again, lots of different variations on this bucket strategy. Here's one I'll highlight that's just a super minimalist portfolio. And I would say that I am a huge evangelist for being a minimalist in terms of your investment portfolio. And that's especially true as you age, where I just think there's value to trying to reduce the number of moving parts that you're overseeing. So this is a portfolio that is composed of cash investments for near-term cash flows, a bond portfolio, and an equity, a globally diversified equity portfolio. I'm a big believer in what are called index tracking funds. These are very low cost investments that basically just mirror whatever market segment that they're tracking. So it turns out that that's a really effective way to invest. And it's also a super low cost way to invest. In fact, the data very much support indexing that paying active managers often doesn't bear fruit relative to one of these inexpensive index funds. So let's see. I want to kind of gloss over this, but just will quickly touch on the value of tax considerations as you're thinking about building a retirement portfolio. So there are really three main silos that you could use for tax sheltered retirement savings. One would be kind of a traditional tax deferred account. And this is what I'll cover here is in the US. I know some of you are outside the US and it's a little bit different, but I'll cover what US investors have in their toolkits when they think about retirement planning. So you have traditional tax deferred accounts where you are making, in some cases, contributions that are tax sheltered. So you are able to make pre-tax contributions. So this is the case if you're contributing to a company provided 401k plan, or if you are contributing to a traditional IRA and your income is below the level where you can deduct that contribution on your tax return. The other side of the bargain is that if you contribute to this type of account, you can enjoy tax sheltered compounding as long as the money is inside of the account. You're not going to pay any taxes on the investment gains. But when you come into retirement, you have to pay taxes on those withdrawals. And those withdrawals are also subject to what are called required minimum distribution rules. So at age 73, you have to start pulling the money out on a predetermined schedule. So that's the basic idea with traditional tax deferred accounts. They're a positive when you're putting the money in because you often get that tax break, but they're taxable upon retirement. And then Roth, it's really the opposite, that you're not earning any tax break on the money going in. So you're putting after tax dollars into the account, But the other side of the bargain is that you aren't going to pay taxes when the money comes out. And Roth accounts are also not subject to those required minimum distributions. And finally, another potential silo would be if you have assets that you want to save outside of traditional retirement vehicles. In that case, you could use just a taxable brokerage account where there are no limits on contributions, no limits on what you can invest in. But you will owe taxes on a year-to-year basis on any investment gains. And when you pull the money out, you're going to owe some tax, but it will be at the lower capital gains tax rate. When you pull money out from a traditional tax deferred account, as I talked about, that's going to be taxable at your ordinary income tax rate. So for a lot of people, this is kind of a fork in the road in terms of trying to figure out which account type to fund. The key calculus for those first two categories is whether you think you're in a high tax bracket at the time of your contribution versus where you will be in retirement. If you think you're at a high tax bracket today, you're better off taking that tax break today. So you're better off making that traditional tax deferred contribution because you're likely, or you think you're likely to be in a lower tax bracket in retirement. On the other hand, the person who is expecting to be in a higher tax bracket in retirement, and this would be true, for the person who has managed to save a lot of investment assets, the Roth contributions will tend to make the most sense. And those taxable brokerage assets will tend to make the most sense if you just need or want a lot of flexibility with your investment accounts, where you don't want to be subject to strictures about when the money must come out of your accounts and so forth. In that case, you'd want to favor a taxable brokerage account. So I'll just kind of zoom through this because I think it's probably more detail than we need today. I want to spend a little bit of time on long-term care planning, and then I do want to leave time for questions. This is the elephant in the room when I speak to groups of older adults, this idea of long-term care costs, how you will pay for them. And they tend to be pretty much outside of our traditional healthcare system. There's a lot of confusion about what Medicare covers with respect to long-term care. And the short answer is not much. So people might have had some sort of qualifying health situation that then lands them in a rehab setting that is covered at least in part by Medicare. But oftentimes people have a long-term care need because of cognitive decline, because of dementia, and that type of care to assist with what are called activities of daily living is not going to be covered by Medicare. And so there are really three main ways of covering long-term care. One is to rely on government provided care, and Medicaid is the main avenue for this. So Medicaid is going to step in and provide long-term care for people who have exhausted most of their investment assets. You're only allowed to hang on to a fairly small share of assets to qualify for Medicaid provided long-term care. Medicaid is the largest payer of long-term care in the US. The issue with Medicaid provided care is that you don't have as much latitude as you might wish in terms of the setting where you would receive the care. Some states are experimenting with home provided Medicaid long-term care, but it really does depend on the state in which you reside and the specific programs that might be available. So that's one avenue that is available for people regardless of financial resources, but you can't have too much to qualify for Medicaid provided care. The other category would be some sort of insurance products to provide long-term care. So there's traditional long-term care insurance where you're purchasing a policy that in turn would provide you with some a degree of daily benefit if you end up needing paid long-term care. And then for people who have a lot of investment assets, it might be appropriate to plan to forego insurance products and instead kind of self-fund their long-term care. And then in addition to considering the financial aspect and how you'll pay for long-term care, it's also worth thinking about what type of care you might wish to receive. So one thing we know is that many people in the US do receive care through kind of informal caregivers. Many of them are family members or friends. In fact, adult daughters tend to be the biggest providers of long-term care in the US. And there are unfortunately disadvantages for those adult daughters in terms of their own careers. And this is a topic that we cover a little bit in our book. And I would also recommend a group called I think it's called daughterhood.org, that is a not-for-profit set up to help address female caregivers of adult parents, because this is just a huge dimension, the financial dimension, the toll on employment, but also the toll on physical health, the toll on financial health for these unpaid family caregivers. So it's worth thinking about the type of care that you wish to receive, the degree to which you want to rely on that friends and family network, or you might not wish to rely on it at all. And it's worth kind of giving thought to that dimension of long-term care as well as the care setting. There aren't any great answers on this front. As I mentioned, Medicaid is quite restricted. There also is what's called a look back period. So for people who have investment assets who might have a thought of giving those assets to their children in order to qualify for Medicaid provided long-term care, Medicaid uses a look back period of 5 years, that if you have sent those investment assets to your loved ones within those 5-year periods, they're effectively counted as part of your own investment assets. I won't spend too much time on the insurance products, except to note that they're out there. They're worth exploring for people who have some investment assets, but not enough investment assets to fully fund long-term care on your own. I would also call out an annual cost of care study that Genworth does. If you're attempting to get your arms around what long-term care might cost, it's exorbitantly expensive. So as of the most recent data run from Genworth, I think it was in the neighborhood of 100,000 per year for long-term care. And in big urban areas, in California, for example, or New York City, it's well in excess of $100,000. So this is a big ticket item. It's easy to see why this gives older adults so much angst. Let's see, just want to touch on the importance of estate planning. I think people often think of estate planning as like this highfalutin thing, like, I don't have an estate, it's going to cost me a lot to set up an estate plan. But a couple of key things I always like to mention in this context is that at a minimum, you need to have those powers of attorney designated. So which people would you want making healthcare or financial decisions for you if for whatever reason you are unable to do so? You should be able to find for your estate forms that you can download to make those designations. So it's really important to designate those people to step in. The person that the courts would turn to make those decisions for you may not be the person who you would choose if you were able to do so. So you can download free forms to get those powers of attorney. It's also worth thinking about the beneficiary designations to the extent that you have investment accounts. Make sure that you're keeping those beneficiary designations up to date, because I think people sometimes are surprised that those beneficiary designations actually trump other aspects of your estate plan. So if you've gone to the trouble of creating a will, for example, the beneficiary designations that you have with your investment providers who will inherit those accounts if something should happen to you will actually supersede any individuals that you've laid out in your will. So those two things should ultimately jibe if possible, but be sure to keep the beneficiary designations up to date. Also, just want to have a quick note on the softer aspects of estate planning, that, you know, it's not all about financial matters. It's also about, if you have pets, for example, who you would want to care for those pets if you couldn't do so. So there are lots of, I think, kind of more gratifying, interesting aspects of estate planning in addition to the strictly financial piece. And then finally, I just want to have a shout out for simplification as you age and as you think about your investment plan, as your financial plan. It's valuable to try to reduce the moving parts in your portfolio. So as I mentioned, I'm a big believer in um, uh, uh, index tracking funds that give you a lot of diversification in a single low cost shot. You also want to try to think about reducing your number of financial entanglements as you age. So reduce your number of investment providers, your number of accounts, and the benefits of that are for you. So we know that cognitive decline is a thing as we age, that the incidence of it increases very linearly with our age. And it also reduces any oversight obligations that your loved ones might have. If something should happen to you, you don't want to turn them over to, you know, some really disorganized mess. You really want to have a tighter list of investment accounts and investment providers. So it's really valuable to do this as, you know, as you move throughout your life cycle in the years leading up to retirement, but especially as you move into retirement. So I'm just going to stop right there. Just a couple of notes about where to find me. My book, as Sheila nicely mentioned, is called How to Retire. I've got a lot of regular articles and videos on morningstar.com. I'm also on X a little bit, and on here's my email address as well, if you would like a copy of the presentation, or maybe the group will make a copy of the presentation available. Either is a-okay with me. So just going to stop my share right here, and I think we have a little bit of time for some questions.
Great, Christine. Thank you so much. And I just want to say, because we have a meeting rather than a webinar, this is our opportunity to ask you questions personally. And let's do that by, at the bottom of your screen, there's a toolbar, and one has a heart. It says react. And at the very bottom, it says raise hand. And see, I just raised my hand, and now you can see that I'll be able to see when you raise your hand. I can call on you, and you can ask your question in real time. If you're shy, just go ahead and type your question in the chat, and I'll ask on your behalf. And while you're getting your thoughts together, I wrote a few questions for Chris. Oh, here's Michelle. Go ahead, Michelle Licht. There you go.
Sorry, I had to
yourself.
unmute myself. Thanks, Christine. This is really helpful. I had a question. You covered it a little bit in your slides, but with regard to maybe changing your funds that are so they're not as aggressive. I'm you know, probably at least 10 years out from retirement. So I'm just wondering if, like, you think in 5 years I should have less aggressive funds in my 401k. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, good question. Thanks, Michelle. I do think it helps to gradually segue into something that looks like that bucket type situation that I talked about, One source, inexpensive source of guidance on how to position a portfolio would be what are called target date funds. And those are kind of all in one-stop funds. I really love them actually in terms of simplification. But even if you have, want to continue to manage your portfolio yourself, they can be a great source of asset allocation guidance. So you could look to, say, the target date 2035 portfolio and see kind of how they're positioned in terms of the bonds in the portfolio, and use that as kind of an inexpensive source of feedback on how your portfolio is positioned. I think that's a good starting point. We're all a little bit different in terms of what we're looking for, but I think it's a kind of a nice source of inexpensive guidance. I also have some model portfolios for people at different kind of life stages that might be useful in that context as well. But one thing to know is, we've had this period of rising interest rates over the past couple of years, in part because of inflation, that the Federal Reserve has been lifting interest rates in an effort to cool down economic activity and to push down on inflation a little bit. Well, the benefit of that for bond investors, and certainly investors in cash type investments like money market accounts or online savings accounts, the benefit is that the yields are now in the realm of like 4.5–5%. So the return prospects are a lot better than they were, obviously, when yields were like barely a half a percentage point a couple of years ago. So arguably, this safer portion of your portfolio is not the dead money that it was a couple of years ago. So it's a little less painful to have those safer assets in your portfolio. So thanks for a good question, Michelle.
Thank you.
And Valerie Jarvie asks, as you mentioned, states differ in their policies. Is there a state you believe offers the most support as far as care resources for retirees?
Good question, Valerie, and I don't know the answer to that question. I don't know the landscape well enough to be able to answer that question.
I have to say, my first career was in registered nursing, and I've found that in semi-rural settings, the lifestyle is a little slower, and the nurses don't move around as much as they might in a big city. So, if there's an option to move somewhere where life is a little bit slower and quieter, then it may turn out to be more humane.
Yeah, certainly the cost of care would be lower, Sheila, too, in a non-urban setting. One issue is that, and this is kind of a separate tangent, we have a caregiver shortage in the US. And this is related to immigration, that immigrants have provided a lot of long-term care, including to my dear parents. We had a couple amazing caregivers who were not born in the US. And, as we are embarking on a process to maybe tighten immigration further, that's going to compound pressure. And I think especially in rural areas where there is there's pressure on caregiver resources. So that's kind of a countervailing force in all of this. And another dimension is the home-based care is just by its very nature, it's more caregiver intensive, right? If you have one person there who's providing care for one other person, it's just less efficient than is the case with people receiving care in an institutional setting. So that's another dimension. It's a complicated topic, but the short answer is we have a true caregiver shortage in the US.
So here's a question for you. If you retire at a time when there's a bad market. Do you just postpone the travel that you intended to do early on in retirement, or your, remodeling projects? You just wait until the markets improve? How do you handle that?
Yeah, this is part of the reason why you would have those safer assets set aside so that you wouldn't have to disturb the the more aggressively positioned assets that would be down in such a scenario. So you confront that problem in in two ways. So one is kind of structuring the portfolio so that you are not having to invade those depressed assets, and then potentially also taking less in that period. The issue is, it's sort of easy to say, but people embarking on retirement, you don't know how healthy you'll be in your later years. So saying, people should delay those travel plans, for example, I'm a little less comfortable with that because you don't necessarily know what the future holds. And I think you can also take some comfort in that slide I showed where you saw the retirement spending looking kind of like a smile, where it was kind of drifting steadily downward in the 65 to 85-year time frame, and then heading up later in life, as I mentioned, for uninsured long-term care costs. Well, those are not necessarily people who are making decisions to spend less. They're just spending less. And many of us know from observing older adults that that is the pattern, right? Where those early years of retirement are kind of the pent up demand years where health is usually good. And so those are the higher spending years. If you can sort of be okay with this trade-off that you'll spend less as you move into your 80s, you can probably spend a little bit more early in retirement, but you do want to make sure that you're not spending from assets that have gone down, which is the logic behind coming into retirement with a portfolio that's more or less balanced in nature.
Thank you. Here's a last question from Antonia Allegra. Considering what seems to be a fact that the incoming government may do away with Social Security, what do you see as action to take for a retired individual?
So it's a good question. The future of Social Security, we could do the whole session on that. One thing I would say is that people should not assume that Social Security is going away, mainly because it is incredibly popular as a program. And we know that people in government want to keep their jobs. And so I do think that Congress will take action to protect Social Security, but I also think it's realistic to assume that there will be some changes to the program, probably not for people who are sort of imminently close to drawing upon Social Security. So I would say, certainly if you're over 55, you are probably quite likely to get your promised benefits. But if you're a younger worker, if you're, say, under 50, I would potentially haircut my promised benefits a little bit by maybe like 20% or so, to account for potential changes in the program, whether they will further elevate the age when we'll be eligible to take Social Security, or perhaps there'd be some means testing around Social Security. You might make some adjustments along those lines, but I don't think it's wise to assume that it goes away altogether, because I just think that's pretty politically unlikely. Of course, never say never, but it's an incredibly popular program and people depend on it. And I just don't see it going away entirely.
Well, thanks a million, Christine, for a truly useful book and presentation. Before we go, here's what's up next. The Washington, D.C. regional chapter will host an online program of social media best practices with culinary influencers Meryl Feinstein, Anina Belgianini, and special guest Brittany Brown Chamberlain on January 28, 7 p.m. Eastern Time. This event is free and open to the public, but a $5 donation is encouraged to support grants and scholarships for women in culinary fields. And I put the registration link for that in the chat. And if you signed on late, don't worry, you're going to get a link to the recorded program, and we will send Christine's PDF slides along with that. And the other thing I want to tell you about is LDEI Live Online is having another monthly program on February 4, 2 p.m. Eastern Time. So if you live in another time, you have to take that into account. And we will have expert chocolatier and culinary school owner Pam Williams, who will talk with us about fine chocolate, how to savor it, and how to save it. You can register now through the link in the chat. And LDEI Live online events are a benefit of membership. Non-members are welcome to attend for a very affordable $10 fee, which supports LDEI's educational mission. I just want to say, if your chapter is organizing online events, let me know. Look up my contact information in the directory, and I'll make sure that it is promoted on all of our communications channels. So with the link to the recorded event, you can rewatch this program if there were some things that you didn't quite catch the first time. I encourage you to get a copy of Christine's book. It's easy reading and very useful. So that's all for now for LDEI, and I'm Sheila Cry. So long until next time.